Section 1. Hey guys, tonight we are stepping inside one of the darkest, most suffocating corners of 19th century America, the prison. Not the kind you've seen in glossy Hollywood dramas with brooding antiheroes and surprisingly decent haircuts. No, we're talking about stone walls so thick they muffled the outside world entirely, cells so narrow you could touch both sides without fully extending your elbows, and a daily routine so grinding, so relentlessly mechanical, that historians still argue whether it was designed to reform the human soul or simply crush it into something more manageable. Tonight, you are not a visitor. You are not reading about this from a comfortable distance. Tonight, you are the prisoner. And I'll warn you right now, you probably won't survive this with your sanity fully intact, but hey, at least you'll be well rested by the end of it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. I genuinely love knowing that someone in rural Manitoba is hearing this at 2 a.m. while their cat judges them silently from across the room. You are my people. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It is somewhere around 4:30 in the morning, and the bell has already started. Not a gentle chime. Not a soft digital tone from a phone you can snooze 3 times before guilt sets in. This is iron on iron, a keeper dragging a metal rod across the bars of your cell block with the specific energy of a man who has decided that if he has to be awake, everyone has to be awake. The sound ricochets off stone walls, bounces down the corridor, and arrives inside your skull before your eyes have fully agreed to open. You are in Auburn, New York. The year is somewhere in the 1840s, though it could just as easily be the 1830s or the 1850s. The decade barely matters because the routine does not change. Auburn State Prison opened in 1816 and became the model for what reformers proudly called the congregate system, meaning prisoners worked and ate together in enforced silence rather than spending every waking hour in solitary confinement. That was considered the humane option, by the way. Let that settle. You sit up on your wooden plank, because that is what your bed is, a plank, occasionally softened by a thin straw mattress that has seen better decades, and for just a moment, before full consciousness arrives, you forget where you are. It lasts maybe 2 seconds. Then the smell hits you. Unwashed bodies, lime-washed stone, the faint metallic tang of the bucket in the corner that serves as your toilet, and underneath all of it, something damp and permanent, like the building itself is exhaling. That moment of forgetting is, prisoners later recalled, both the best and worst part of the day. Best because it is the only peace you get. Worst because remembering is its own small violence, repeated every single morning. You swing your legs off the plank. The floor is stone. Your feet are wrapped in whatever passes for socks, coarse wool, stiff, slightly damp because everything in here is slightly damp, and you slide them into your prison-issued brogans. These are shoes in the loosest technical sense. They are stiff leather, poorly fitted, because they were not fitted to you at all. They were made by other prisoners in the cobbling shop, sized approximately, and handed to you with the quiet institutional message that your comfort is beside the point. You have roughly 10 minutes before the cell door opens and the day's machinery begins grinding. In those 10 minutes, you are expected to fold your blanket, if you have one, straighten your plank, and present yourself in a state that the keeper will find acceptable. There is no mirror. There has not been a mirror in months. You have largely stopped wondering what you look like, which is perhaps a mercy. The cell block around you is beginning to stir. You can hear it, the shuffle of feet, the creak of wood, the occasional muffled cough that someone is trying very hard to suppress because drawing attention to yourself, even through involuntary biology, feels dangerous here. Nobody speaks. That is not a social choice. That is the rule, and the rule has teeth. Historians still argue whether the silence systems imposed at Auburn and similar institutions caused measurable psychological damage to inmates or whether the surviving records, mostly written by administrators with obvious incentives to report success, accurately reflect the reality prisoners experienced. What is less contested is that the silence was total, enforced through punishment, and that men found extraordinary creative ways to communicate anyway, through finger signals, lip movements, and a kind of cellular Morse code tapped against shared walls in the deep watches of the night. But that is for later. Right now, it is not yet 5 in the morning, and the bell is still ringing, and your feet are already cold inside those terrible shoes, and the keeper's footsteps are moving down the corridor toward your door with the steady rhythm of someone who has done this exact walk approximately 10,000 times and will do it 10,000 more. The lock turns. The door swings open. And your day, your long, gray, grinding, relentless day, has officially begun. You step forward into the corridor, and you do not make eye contact with anyone, because that too, in its own way, is part of surviving this place. Eyes down. Feet moving. The machine takes you. The corridor outside your cell is wider than the cell itself, which sounds like faint praise, and it is. The cell block stretches ahead of you in both directions, a long stone gallery lined with identical doors, identical men emerging from identical rectangles of darkness, all of them moving with that particular shuffling economy of motion that you have already, without quite realizing it, begun to adopt yourself. You don't stride here. You don't walk with any particular purpose or personality. You move the way water moves through a pipe, directed, contained, and entirely at the mercy of whatever system built the infrastructure around you. But before the march truly begins, before the day pulls you fully into its current, you are briefly returned to your cell for the morning inspection. The keeper, a heavy-set man with a ring of keys at his hip that jangles with every step like some kind of institutional wind chime, walks the line of open doors and peers inside each cell with the practiced eye of someone looking for violations he fully expects to find. A blanket folded wrong. A bucket not emptied correctly. A scratch on the wall that wasn't there yesterday. These are the things that matter here, not because they matter in any cosmic sense, but because enforcing attention to small things is how large control is maintained. Your cell, in the Auburn system, measures approximately 3.5 feet wide, 7 feet long, and 7 feet tall. If you are of average height for the period, around 5 feet 7 inches, you can lie down fully, stand fully, and take perhaps 2 full steps in any direction before meeting a wall. That's it. That is the full geographic scope of your private world. 3.5 by 7 feet of cut stone, lime-washed to a pale, indifferent white that was probably meant to feel clean and perhaps even hopeful and instead feels like the inside of a skull. In the Pennsylvania system Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, which opened in 1829 and operated on entirely different philosophical principles, your cell would actually be slightly larger, because you would be spending essentially your entire existence inside it. The Pennsylvania model believed in complete solitary confinement as the path to moral reformation. You would eat alone, sleep alone, exercise alone in a small private yard attached to your cell, and work alone on handicrafts brought to you by guards. When you were moved through the prison, to see a doctor, to attend chapel, you wore a hood over your head so you could not see or be seen by other inmates. The theory was that isolation would force you into confrontation with your own conscience, and that conscience, given enough quiet, would do the reforming work the state required. The theory was not entirely without supporters. Charles Dickens, who visited Eastern State in 1842, was not one of them. He wrote afterward that the system inflicted tortures that no man had a right to inflict upon another, and that the mental anguish it produced was invisible only because it left no marks on the body. Historians still argue whether Dickens was responding to genuine systemic cruelty or whether his famously dramatic sensibility amplified what was, by the standards of the era, considered a progressive penal experiment. What is harder to argue with is that prolonged solitary confinement produces measurable psychological deterioration, a fact that 19th-century administrators understood far less clearly than we do now, though some prisoners made it plain enough in the records they left behind. You are in Auburn, so you are spared the hood and the total isolation, but your cell is still your cell, and you are about to spend the next 12 hours doing everything possible not to return to it, because the only thing worse than being inside it during working hours is being sent back to it as punishment. The cell is punishment dressed up as accommodation. It is where you sleep and where you are warehoused, and the line between those two functions is thinner than the straw in your mattress. The mattress itself deserves a moment of attention, because it is one of those details that sounds almost manageable until you have slept on it for 3 consecutive months. It is a cloth sack, roughly sewn, filled with straw that compresses quickly and unevenly, so that within weeks you are effectively sleeping on a lumpy wooden surface with a thin fabric suggestion of cushioning between you and the plank. Some prisoners supplemented their mattresses with whatever materials they could quietly acquire, extra cloth, bundled rags, in one documented case a collection of dried corn husks that a prisoner in a Western facility had been hoarding for weeks before a keeper discovered them and confiscated them with the solemnity of a man neutralizing a genuine threat. The walls of your cell, if you look closely in the thin morning light filtering through the single small window, set high, barred, and sized to admit light without admitting any meaningful view of the outside world, show the history of previous occupants. Not in any dramatic way. No elaborate carvings or secret messages, because those would be discovered and punished. But there are marks. Small ones. A series of vertical scratches that might be days counted. A worn patch on the wall at shoulder height where someone stood, probably often, probably for reasons that are not difficult to imagine. A faint discoloration near the floor where the damp has worked its way through the stone and left a permanent watermark shaped, if you tilt your head slightly, like nothing in particular. These traces of the people who came before you are oddly comforting in the way that finding a worn groove in a public bench is comforting. Someone else was here, someone else endured this specific geometry of confinement, and the wall is still standing, and so, presumably, were they. You add nothing to the wall. Not yet. But you note the marks, the way you note everything in a space this small, with a thoroughness born of having nothing else to look at. The keeper's keys jangle closer. Inspection is nearly done. In a moment, the door will swing shut behind you and you will join the line in the corridor, and the cell will become, briefly, a memory. You will spend the rest of the day trying not to think about it. You will fail, intermittently, in ways that are their own small education in what it means to carry a place inside you whether you want to or not. The line forms in the corridor with a quiet efficiency that would almost be impressive if it weren't so deeply unsettling. 30, 40, sometimes 60 men, depending on the size of the cell block, arranging themselves in single file with the practiced automaticity of people who have learned, through repeated and unpleasant instruction, that hesitation costs something. You find your place. You face forward. You put your hands at your sides or clasped behind your back, depending on what this particular facility's keeper prefers, and you do not speak. You do not whisper. You do not mouth words at the man in front of you or cut your eyes sideways at the man behind. You stand in the silence like a nail that has decided, after several applications of the hammer, that staying flat is simply the easier option. The silence rule is the spine of the Auburn system. It is not incidental to the philosophy, it is the philosophy, or at least the most visible expression of it. Elam Linz, one of the most influential and widely feared wardens in early American penal history, believed with genuine conviction that silence was the essential precondition for rehabilitation. His reasoning, stated plainly in his own words, was that criminals were, at their moral core, cowards, and that cowards required absolute domination before they could be reshaped into productive citizens. Silence was domination made audible through its own absence. It was control you could hear in the way you can hear a held breath. Linz was not a subtle man. He reintroduced corporal punishment to Auburn in the early 1820s, specifically the lash, as the enforcement mechanism for the silence rule, and he defended this position publicly and without apparent discomfort for the rest of his career. When critics argued that whipping prisoners was barbaric, Linz responded, in essence, that softness was a luxury that reformers could afford because they didn't have to manage the men in question. Historians still argue whether Linz was a pragmatic administrator responding to genuine institutional challenges or simply a man whose appetite for dominance found perfect institutional cover in the language of reform. Both things, of course, can be true simultaneously, which is one of history's more uncomfortable recurring features. The silence, as you are experiencing it right now in this corridor, is not peaceful. That is the first and most important thing to understand about it. Silence in a place of genuine calm, a library, a forest, the moments just before sleep, has a texture that is soft and permeable, something you sink into. The silence here is architectural. It is a structure with load-bearing walls. It presses against you from all sides, and it is enforced with enough consistency that your body has already begun to anticipate punishment as a reflex whenever the urge to speak arises. You don't just choose not to talk. You flinch away from talking the way you'd flinch from a hot surface, even when the heat source isn't immediately present. And yet, and this is the part that would drive the wardens absolutely mad if they could fully see it, the silence is not total. It never was. From the very earliest days of the Auburn system, prisoners developed an intricate parallel language that operated just beneath the threshold of what keepers could reliably detect and punish. Ventriloquism was one method, genuinely practiced by some prisoners with enough skill to project sound in misleading directions. Finger spelling, a rudimentary form of sign language, invented independently by prisoners with no access to formal signing systems, became widespread enough in some facilities that keepers began specifically watching for hand movements. Lip reading was cultivated as both a sending and receiving skill, conducted in the periphery of vision so that a man's eyes could appear to be facing forward while his mouth moved in the tiniest possible increments. There was also tapping. A system of knocks against shared cell walls, developed organically and varying from block to block, allowed prisoners to communicate at night when visual monitoring was minimal. The rhythms were not complex, this was not Morse code with its elegant standardization, but they were sufficient. Sufficient to warn someone that a particular keeper was in a bad mood today. Sufficient to pass news about punishments handed down. Sufficient, in the most fragile and human sense, to remind another person in the dark that they were not entirely alone. You have learned some of this. Not all of it, you are not yet fluent in the underground grammar of this place, but enough. You know that a quick double tap on the shared wall between your cell and the one beside it means something like all clear, and a slow triple tap means something closer to be careful. You know that the man 3 places ahead of you in this line has a tell when he's about to try to communicate, a slight backward tilt of his head, barely perceptible, and that you should not respond to it today because the keeper on morning duty has been watching that particular man with specific attention for the past week. You know these things the way you know all things in here, not because anyone sat you down and explained them, but because you watched, and you waited, and you paid the kind of attention that only becomes available to you when the alternative is having nothing to pay attention to at all. Prison, whatever else it is a masterclass in noticing. You become, by necessity, a student of micro-expressions, of the particular quality of a key turning in a lock, of the difference between a keeper's footstep that is simply walking and a keeper's footstep that is walking toward something specific. The line begins to move. Single file, measured pace, the shuffle step that will become the lockstep later in the day during outdoor movement, a formalized march in which each prisoner places his hand on the shoulder of the man ahead and the entire line moves as one organism. A visual demonstration of control so complete it reportedly impressed foreign visitors enough that several European nations sent delegations to observe and consider adapting it. The lockstep was, among other things, excellent theater. But right now it is just the shuffle toward breakfast, and the silence wraps around you like weather, and somewhere behind you a man coughs once and then swallows the next cough with what sounds like considerable effort, and the keeper's keys jangle, and the corridor smells of stone and men and morning, and you move forward because forward is the only direction the system has left available to you. The mess hall announces itself before you arrive. It is the smell that reaches you first, a warm, starchy, faintly sour exhalation that drifts down the corridor like a rumor, something that is technically food adjacent without committing fully to the promise. By the time you shuffle through the doorway and find your assigned seat at one of the long wooden tables, rows of them, parallel, close enough together that the men across from you are near enough to count the hairs on their forearms, yet conversation remains as prohibited here as anywhere else in the building, you have already adjusted your expectations downward to a level that would have seemed incomprehensible to you a year ago. You sit. You face forward, or in some facilities you face the wall, because the congregate systems administrators were deeply suspicious of eye contact as a vector for communication and conspiracy. Some wardens required prisoners to eat while staring at a blank surface, which is, when you think about it, a remarkably precise way to take something as fundamentally communal as eating and strip it of every quality that makes communal eating human. You eat beside other people in the same way that parallel lines exist beside each other, close in proximity, incapable of meeting. The food arrives carried by prisoners assigned to kitchen duty, which is considered something of a coveted position not because the kitchen work is easy, it is not, but because kitchen workers had documented access to slightly larger quantities of food and, more importantly, the occasional opportunity to eat something warm at a moment of their own choosing rather than the institution's. The server sets a bowl in front of you without ceremony. This is your breakfast. Today, as most days, it is cornmeal mush. Tomorrow it will also probably be cornmeal mush. The day after that, the suspense is not particularly suspenseful. Cornmeal mush, boiled cornmeal cooked to a thick, pale porridge, was the foundational dietary staple of American prisons throughout most of the 19th century, particularly in northern states where corn was abundant and cheap and no one in an administrative position was losing sleep over the culinary experience of convicted felons. It provided calories in a reliable if monotonous way, and calories were, in the institutional calculus, the primary dietary objective. Flavor was not part of the calculus. Texture was an afterthought. The mush was sometimes accompanied by a piece of bread, dense and dark, made from whatever grain was currently cheapest and baked in the prison bakery by prisoners who were, in a quietly ironic twist, probably the most skilled bakers in the county by the time they were released. On better days, and you learn quickly to recognize and quietly treasure better days, there might be a thin soup at the midday or evening meal, or a small piece of salt pork, or beans cooked to a softness that suggests they have been in the pot for approximately one geological era. Vegetables appeared seasonally and inconsistently. Some prisons maintained gardens worked by prisoner labor, which meant that in late summer you might encounter a boiled potato or a piece of turnip with the resigned frequency of someone who has made peace with root vegetables as the ceiling of their agricultural optimism. One of the quirkier documented details of prison food in this era involves the practice at some facilities of serving rye coffee, a beverage made from roasted rye grain rather than actual coffee beans, which were considered an unnecessary expense. Rye coffee looks approximately like coffee, smells approximately like coffee in the way that a drawing of a fire looks approximately like fire, and provides none of coffee's more useful properties. Prisoners drank it because it was hot and because hot things in a cold stone building carry their own value entirely independent of flavor. Some men, according to later accounts, came to genuinely prefer it, which either speaks to the adaptability of human taste or to the persuasive power of having no alternative. The eating itself is conducted in silence, of course, and at a pace that is regulated by a bell or a signal from the keeper stationed at the front of the room. You eat when eating begins. You stop when eating ends. The window between those two events is not generous. Approximately 15 to 20 minutes, by most accounts, enough time to consume what is in the bowl if you approach the task with focus and without distraction. You approach it with focus. You have learned not to waste time at the table contemplating the philosophical dimensions of your breakfast, because the bell will ring whether you are ready or not and the bowl will be taken whether it is empty or not. What happens in the mess hall that the keepers cannot entirely prevent, despite the silence and the wall facing and the regulated pace, is the economy. Not a spoken economy, nothing so blatant. But a gestural one, conducted in the passing of a hand over a table surface, in the deliberate placement of a bread piece at a particular location, in the way a bowl might be slid an inch in one direction before a keeper's gaze sweeps back across the room. Food is currency here, and currency implies transaction, and transaction implies relationship, and relationship implies the precise kind of human social infrastructure that the silence system was theoretically designed to prevent. Historians still argue whether prison administrators of the 1800s genuinely believed the silence system was eliminating prisoner social bonds or whether the more sophisticated among them understood that what they were actually doing was driving those bonds underground, where they became harder to monitor and, paradoxically, more resilient. What is clear from the documentary record is that prisoner social networks existed, persisted, and adapted to every new enforcement mechanism the institution applied, with the cheerful tenacity of something that has evolved specifically to survive in hostile conditions. You finish your mush. It sits in your stomach with the comfortable heaviness of something whose primary virtue is mass. You are not satisfied, exactly, but you are less empty than you were, and in this place, the distance between those two states is the closest thing to contentment available before noon. The keeper's signal comes. You stand. You return your bowl. You file back into line, and the morning machinery engages its next gear, and whatever softness the warmth of the mess hall briefly offered folds back into the stone cold of the corridor, and you carry the memory of something hot in your stomach like a small banked coal against the chill of whatever comes next. What comes next is work. Not work in the sense you might have known before, the kind with natural rhythms, with small autonomies, with the ability to pause and stretch and decide, even briefly, that you will look out a window for 30 seconds before returning to whatever your hands were doing. This is work as the institution conceives it, which is to say work as a mechanism, work as punishment wearing the costume of productivity, work as the visible evidence that the prison is earning its keep and so, by extension, are you. The bell rings, the line forms, and the labor gangs march out with that same measured shuffle that is quickly becoming the only gait your body remembers how to perform. Auburn's great innovation, the thing that made it the most widely copied prison model in 19th century America and, eventually, the world, was contract prison labor. The concept was straightforward and, from a certain administrative angle, elegant. Private businesses contracted with the prison to use inmate labor, supplying raw materials and taking finished goods. The prison provided the workers, the space, and the discipline. The contractor provided the work, the tools, and a per diem rate per prisoner that offset the cost of running the institution. In theory, everyone benefited. The state saved money. The contractor got cheap labor. The prisoner learned a trade. In practice, the arrangement was considerably more complicated and considerably less mutually beneficial than that tidy summary suggests. You might be making shoes. Or barrels. Or furniture. Or combs cut from horn, or brushes assembled from bristle and wood, or nails hammered out at a forge in the prison workshop with the mechanical repetition of a task so simplified it can be performed by someone whose attention is partly consumed by the ongoing effort of not accidentally making eye contact with the keeper stationed 6 feet away. The specific product barely matters because the experience is roughly consistent regardless. You stand or sit at your station, you perform your assigned motion, and you perform it again, and again, and again, through the morning hours with breaks timed to institutional convenience rather than human physiology. The lockstep march that carries you to your work assignment deserves its own moment of attention because it is one of those details of 19th century prison life that sounds almost farcical until you consider what it feels like to be inside it. Each prisoner places his right hand on the right shoulder of the man directly ahead of him. The line then moves in a synchronized shuffle, right foot, right foot, with each man's body close enough to the man ahead that the distance between you is measured in inches. The entire column moves as a single articulated creature, and if you have ever watched a very long caterpillar navigate an obstacle you have some rough visual approximation of the effect, though the caterpillar presumably finds the experience more voluntary. The lockstep was designed to prevent conversation and to make escape attempts immediately obvious, but it also served a subtler function. It was a daily physical demonstration of the prisoner's absorption into the institutional body. You were not marching beside other men. You were a component of a single moving structure, and structures do not have opinions or preferences or interior lives worth consulting. Several European penal reformers who visited Auburn in the 1830s and 1840s reported being deeply impressed by the lockstep's visual order, describing it in terms that suggest they were watching something closer to choreography than incarceration. The prisoners performing it tended not to use the word choreography. Free labor advocates outside the prison walls had increasingly strong feelings about contract prison labor throughout the mid to late 1800s. Skilled tradesmen and their guilds argued, with considerable justification, that prison-made goods undercut their wages by flooding markets with products made by workers who cost contractors a fraction of what free labor commanded. This tension produced one of the more sustained public debates of the era about the proper relationship between punishment, labor, and economic fairness, a debate that would eventually result in legislation in multiple states restricting or eliminating prison labor contracts by the century's end. Historians still argue whether these restrictions were primarily motivated by genuine concern for prisoner welfare, by the economic self-interest of free labor advocates, or by some proportion of both that varied depending on who was doing the arguing and in which legislative chamber. Inside the workshop, the noise is considerable. Hammers, saws, the rhythmic thump of machinery where machinery has been introduced, the hiss of the forge, the scrape of tool against material, all of it filling the space with a din that is, in its own strange way, a relief from the silence of the corridors and the mess hall. You cannot be punished for the sounds your work makes. The tools are loud and the work is loud, and inside that loudness there is a narrow corridor of something that is not quite freedom but is at least a different quality of constraint. Your hands know what they are doing by now. The motion has been internalized to the point where your body performs it without requiring your full conscious participation, which means your mind is, briefly, somewhere else. Where it goes is your own business, and it is one of the few things in this building that remains genuinely yours. Some men, by their own later accounts, spent their working hours in sustained memory, replaying scenes from before, conversations with people they would not see again for years, the specific texture of particular ordinary moments that had seemed unremarkable at the time and now carried the luminous weight of everything lost. Others constructed elaborate interior narratives, stories in which they were elsewhere, doing other things, being other versions of themselves. A few, the ones with a certain temperament, simply counted. Repetitive tasks invite counting, and counting has a meditative quality that can, if you let it, carry you through several hours on a kind of cognitive autopilot that is neither pleasant nor unpleasant but is at least forward motion through time. The keeper moves through the workshop periodically, checking the pace of work, checking the quality of output, checking for the thousand small violations that the silent system made into potential infractions. You keep your eyes on your hands. Your hands keep moving. Outside, somewhere beyond the walls you cannot see from where you sit, the morning sun is climbing toward midday with the indifference of celestial bodies toward the specific miseries occurring beneath them. The keeper who works your block in the morning hours is a man whose name you know but do not use, even internally, because giving him a name feels like granting him a dimension he hasn't earned. You think of him instead by his keys, by the particular rhythm of his footfall, by the way he clears his throat before stopping at a workstation to observe, a half-second warning that you have learned to read the way a sailor reads a shift in wind. He is not the worst keeper in this facility. You know this because you have encountered the worst keeper in this facility, briefly, during your second week, and the comparison is clarifying in the way that minor dental pain becomes clarifying after you have experienced something significantly worse. The keeper class in 19th-century American prisons occupied a position of almost total power over the men in their charge, bounded theoretically by institutional rules and practically by however much their warden chose to enforce those rules on any given day. The qualifications required to become a keeper varied enormously by facility and era, but they were rarely rigorous. A man needed to be physically capable, willing to work irregular hours for modest pay, and possessed of enough temperamental steadiness to manage a population of men who had, by definition, already demonstrated a willingness to operate outside established social boundaries. Beyond that, the hiring bar was not set at an elevation that would trouble most applicants unduly. What this meant in practice was that the quality of a prisoner's daily experience depended enormously on the specific character of the men assigned to supervise him, a variable so significant that prisoners' later memoirs and accounts frequently organized their recollections not by year or by facility but by keeper, the way civilians in a war zone might organize their memories around which soldiers happened to be stationed in their neighborhood. A keeper with a sadistic streak and a warden who looked the other way was a combination that produced conditions the official record rarely captured accurately, because official records were written by administrators with strong incentives to describe their facilities in terms that justified continued funding and public support. Your morning keeper is, by the standards available to you, manageable. He enforces the silence rule consistently, which means he is at least predictable, and predictability is a form of safety in an environment where arbitrary authority is the alternative. He moves through the workshop at regular intervals, roughly every 12 to 15 minutes, a rhythm you have internalized without consciously deciding to, and his inspections follow a pattern. He checks the work output first, then the posture of the worker, then the immediate workspace for any evidence of unauthorized activity. He does not linger at any single station long enough to suggest targeted suspicion unless something has caught his attention, and if something has caught his attention, you will know it from the quality of the silence that falls around him, slightly denser than the ordinary silence, weighted with imminence. The power dynamic between keeper and prisoner in this era was absolute in theory and negotiated in practice, which is a distinction that matters enormously to the people living inside it. Officially, a keeper's word was law and a prisoner's word was worth roughly nothing in any dispute between them. Practically, keepers who pushed their authority to its absolute limits tended to encounter a population of men who had very little left to lose and a great deal of time to think creatively about their options. This created an informal equilibrium that neither side would ever have described as such. Keepers maintained the appearance of total control, prisoners maintained the appearance of total compliance, and somewhere in the space between those two performances, actual daily life occurred. Inspections of the workspace were also, theoretically, inspections of the prisoner's person, checking for contraband, for prohibited items, for anything that suggested activity outside the narrow bandwidth of sanctioned behavior. The list of prohibited items in most 19th century prisons reads like a catalog of everything that makes human life bearable: playing cards, tobacco in excess of any officially permitted allotment, written materials beyond what was specifically authorized, money, food stored outside meal times, any object that could be construed as a tool for communication or escape. The ingenuity with which prisoners concealed prohibited items was, by all accounts, remarkable, a natural consequence of the fact that the people doing the concealing had significant motivation, considerable idle mental capacity during working hours, and months or years to refine their techniques. Tobacco deserves particular mention because it functioned as the currency of 19th century prison life in a way that predates and anticipates its famous role in 20th century prison economies. Where it was prohibited outright, it was smuggled. Where it was permitted in controlled quantities, those quantities were carefully hoarded, strategically deployed, and traded with a sophistication that would have impressed a commodities broker. A man's relationship to tobacco in this environment had almost nothing to do with the physiological pleasure of smoking and almost everything to do with its function as a portable, divisible, universally valued store of exchange that could be used to acquire information, favors, protection, and the thousand small alleviations that made the difference between a day that was merely grim and a day that was genuinely dangerous. The morning wears on. Your hands continue their work. The keeper completes another circuit of the workshop and returns to his post near the door, where he stands with the particular stillness of a man who has learned to perform vigilance as a posture rather than an activity. Outside the high, barred windows of the workshop, the light has shifted from the thin gray of early morning to something approaching actual daylight, though the windows are positioned and sized in such a way that the light arrives as information about the outside world rather than any genuine experience of it. You know it is morning because the light says so. You cannot feel it on your skin. You cannot hear what it might be illuminating beyond these walls. You receive it secondhand, filtered through glass and iron, like most things in this place. Your hands keep moving. The keeper's keys jangle softly as he shifts his weight. Somewhere in the workshop, a tool strikes a surface at the wrong angle and produces a sound just slightly outside the acceptable register of workshop noise, and for one suspended moment every man in the room performs the same microcalculation. Was that loud enough to draw attention, and if so, whose attention, and what will that attention cost, before the moment passes and the work resumes and the morning continues its slow, grinding transit toward noon. The signal for the midday break arrives not as relief but as a slight recalibration of pressure, the difference between a fist clenched and a fist merely tight. The bell rings once, a single iron note that travels through the workshop and lands in your chest with a vibration you feel before you fully process it as sound, and the machinery of enforced productivity stutters and pauses and the hands around you slow and stop with the unanimity of something choreographed. You set down your tool. You do not stretch, or at least you try not to in any way that is visible, because demonstrating physical discomfort is somehow coded here as a form of complaint, and complaint is a luxury that the system has specifically not budgeted for. You breathe. Slightly deeper than you have been breathing for the past several hours, which is its own commentary on how the body compresses itself under sustained institutional observation. The midday break in most Auburn-style prisons during the mid-1800s ran to approximately 10 minutes on the shorter end and 30 minutes on the more generous end, depending on the facility, the season, the warden's current philosophy, and approximately 40 other variables that no prisoner could reliably predict or influence. 10 minutes is not very long. It is long enough to eat something if eating has been scheduled for this interval, long enough to use the privy facilities, long enough to stand in a slightly different position than the one you have occupied for the past several hours. It is not long enough to rest in any sense that the word rest usually implies. It is, at its core, a maintenance interval, the institutional equivalent of oiling a hinge so that it continues to function for the afternoon shift. What it is, unofficially and invisibly and with the fragile persistence of water finding cracks in stone, is something else entirely. 10 minutes of reduced supervision, not absent supervision, never absent, but reduced, the keepers momentarily occupied with the logistics of the break itself, is 10 minutes in which the underground social life of the prison breathes slightly more freely. Not openly. Never openly. But the quality of the silence shifts during the break in ways that are perceptible to anyone who has spent enough time calibrating themselves to this environment. It becomes, for lack of a better word, inhabited. The same silence, but with more people living inside it. You are standing near the wall of the workshop yard, if you have been allowed outside for this interval, which happens in warmer months with enough frequency to make the memory of outdoor air something you carry into the colder seasons as a kind of sensory savings account. The sky above the prison yard is whatever the sky happens to be today. You have stopped having strong feelings about weather, which represents one of the more subtle psychological losses of institutional life, the slow erosion of preferences that have no purchase in an environment where preference is irrelevant. But you tilt your face up anyway, briefly, the way a plant tilts toward a window, not because you have decided to but because something below decision level makes the motion for you. The man next to you, close enough that your sleeves are nearly touching, which is as close as most meaningful communication happens here, shifts his weight in a way that is not quite accidental. You do not look at him directly. You are both looking at approximately the same patch of sky or wall or middle distance, the visual equivalent of two people having a conversation while staring straight ahead at a bar, which is a posture that contains its own kind of intimacy. What passes between you is minimal. A breath adjusted in length. A subtle shift of fingers against a thigh. The barest movement of lips that produces no sound but shapes a word, maybe two, that you read from the corner of your vision with the peripheral fluency you have been developing for months. The information exchanged is rarely dramatic. It is the texture of daily survival, which keeper is rotating onto the afternoon shift and what his current mood reportedly is, whether the punishment block took anyone last night and if so who, whether the kitchen detail heard anything worth knowing, whether a particular prisoner's illness is genuine or performed, which it matters to know because performed illness is a strategy for lighter work assignments and genuine illness is a warning about conditions in the sleeping quarters. This is the new cycle of your world, and it runs on stolen seconds and peripheral vision and the extraordinary human capacity to communicate meaning through the smallest possible signal. Historians still argue whether the social bonds formed under conditions of enforced silence were stronger or weaker than those formed under normal conditions of free communication, whether shared adversity and the intimacy of covert contact created genuine solidarity or merely the functional alliances of people with temporarily overlapping survival interests. The prisoners themselves, in the memoirs and accounts that survive, tend to describe these connections with a warmth that suggests something more than pure utility, though they also describe betrayals with a vividness that suggests the warmth was never unconditional. One of the more quietly remarkable documented aspects of prison social life in this era is the speed at which information traveled through institutions that were specifically designed to prevent its travel. News of events outside the prison, a war, an election, a notable crime, reached prisoners through visiting family members, through sympathetic guards, through new arrivals who carried the outside world in with them like pollen on their clothes. Once inside, the information moved through the population with a rapidity that administrators found consistently baffling and that makes perfect sense when you understand that a community of people with nothing to do but pay close attention and nowhere to direct their considerable ingenuity except toward the problem of communication is going to develop extraordinarily efficient information networks regardless of what architectural and regulatory obstacles are placed in their way. The bell rings again. The break ends with the same blunt finality with which it began. The bodies around you reorganize into lines, into the shuffle, into the forward-facing performed compliance that the afternoon requires. You fall into place. The brief, inhabited quality of the silence folds back into its harder daytime form. Your hands remember what they were doing. The afternoon opens in front of you like a room you have already memorized, every corner accounted for, no surprises available, which is its own particular kind of weight to carry back through the workshop door and into the hours that remain before evening. The afternoon is where the body begins to file its complaints. Not loudly, you have learned to muffle the signals your physical self sends upward toward consciousness, to process them at a lower level and return a response that amounts to noted, but not actionable, but with a persistence that the morning's relative freshness was able to mostly suppress. Your lower back, which has been communicating its dissatisfaction since approximately the second hour of the morning shift, has by now escalated from suggestion to statement. Your hands, if you look at them during a moment when the keeper's gaze is elsewhere, have developed a redness across the knuckles and a stiffness in the joints that you no longer find remarkable because remarkable implies a baseline of comparison that recedes further into memory with every passing week. Prison labor in the 1800s was not calibrated to the long-term physical well-being of the people performing it. This is not a surprising observation, but it is worth sitting with, because the gap between what the body can endure in the short term and what repeated daily extraction costs over months and years is a gap that institutional accounting rarely bothered to measure. A prisoner who arrived healthy and left after 3 years with permanently damaged joints, compromised vision from working in poor light, or respiratory problems from workshop dust and forge smoke did not appear as a line item in any administrative budget. The cost was paid entirely by the prisoner, in a currency the prison had no mechanism for acknowledging. The work in the afternoon is identical to the work in the morning, which is the point. The repetition is not incidental, it is the design. Reformers of the Auburn School believed that the discipline of repeated productive labor was itself the rehabilitative mechanism, that the body trained to industry would carry that training out through the prison gates and into a life of honest productivity. The theory had a certain internal logic that is easier to appreciate if you are not the one performing the repetition. From inside the repetition, the effect is less ennobling and more erosive, a slow wearing away of the self's edges, a gradual homogenization of experience that makes Tuesday indistinguishable from Thursday and this week's Thursday indistinguishable from last month's. Eye strain was endemic in prison workshops of this era, particularly in facilities where the work involved fine detail, comb cutting, watch part assembly, the more precise grades of furniture making, and where the lighting was provided by windows that were sized for security rather than illumination. Candles or oil lamps supplemented natural light in darker months, but they were allocated by institutional generosity rather than occupational need, which meant they were rarely sufficient. Men who entered prison with good vision and spent years doing close detail work in inadequate light frequently left with significantly diminished eyesight, a fact documented in enough prison medical records of the period to constitute a pattern rather than an anomaly. The contract system created a specific additional pressure that operated alongside the physical toll of the work itself. Contractors had productivity expectations, and those expectations were enforced through the keeper assigned to oversee the contracted work, who had his own institutional incentives to meet the contractor's quotas. This meant that the pace of work in contract labor shops was set not by what was comfortable or sustainable but by what the contract required, and the enforcement mechanism for falling short of that pace was the same enforcement mechanism applied to every other infraction in the building. The lash, or the threat of the lash, or one of the other disciplinary instruments that the institution had developed for the purpose of behavioral adjustment, which you will become more closely acquainted with before this day is complete, even if only through proximity and sound. A quirky footnote to the contract labor system, documented in the records of several northeastern prisons, involves the recurring problem of product sabotage, prisoners deliberately introducing subtle defects into finished goods as a form of resistance that was difficult to prove and nearly impossible to punish individually. A shoe with a slightly misplaced stitch that would fail after a few weeks of wear. A barrel stave fitted just loosely enough that the barrel might develop a slow leak. A comb with a tine filed to a thickness that would snap under moderate use. None of these individual acts of what might generously be called quality control theater were dramatic enough to constitute clear evidence of intentional sabotage, and all of them together constituted a persistent, low-grade friction in the machinery of prison productivity that contractors complained about endlessly and administrators addressed with periodic crackdowns that never quite resolved the underlying dynamic. You are not, at this particular moment, engaged in subtle sabotage. You are doing your work with the mechanical faithfulness of someone who has calculated that the risk-reward ratio does not favor anything more adventurous this afternoon. But you are aware that the man at the station to your diagonal, far enough that direct observation would require the keeper to turn his head at a specific angle, has been working at a pace that is just slightly, almost imperceptibly, below the expected rate. Not slow enough to be an obvious infraction. Slow enough to be a statement, if you know how to read statements made in the language of marginally reduced productivity. You know how to read it. You make no acknowledgement. You keep your own pace steady. Your shoulders have joined the conversation that your back and hands have been having since mid-morning. The particular muscle that runs from the base of your neck to the top of your right shoulder has developed a tightness that pulses with each repeated motion, a rhythmic accompaniment to the work that you have learned to breathe around rather than into. Breathing into pain in this context, allowing yourself to fully register it, to let it occupy the foreground of your attention, is counterproductive in a way that goes beyond the obvious. Pain fully attended to becomes a clock, and a clock in an environment where time moves as slowly as it does here is a form of torture that the institution has not even had to deliberately design. So you breathe around it. You keep your eyes on your work. The light through the high windows has shifted from its noon angle to something lower and more amber, which tells you the afternoon is progressing without telling you precisely how far it has progressed, because precision about time is another luxury that this environment does not especially provide. The bell will come when the bell comes. Until then, your hands move, and the afternoon moves with them, and the body continues its patient, persistent, largely ignored inventory of everything it is costing you to be here. There is a building at the far end of the yard that you do not look at directly. This is not a rule, no keeper has specifically instructed you to avert your gaze from it, but it is a behavioral adaptation that most prisoners develop within their first few weeks, the same way people in certain social situations learn not to stare at something that everyone in the room is aware of but no one wants to be caught acknowledging. The building is low, stone, with a door of reinforced wood and a lock that is heavier than the locks on the cell blocks. It does not need a sign. Everyone knows what it is. It is the place where the disciplinary system goes when it has exhausted its more moderate options, and its presence at the periphery of your daily movement through this facility functions less as a physical location and more as a sustained atmospheric pressure, a weather system that never quite arrives or departs but maintains a permanent influence on the climate of everything beneath it. The disciplinary apparatus of American prisons in the 1800s was varied, contested, frequently brutal, and almost universally justified by its practitioners in the language of reform and necessity. At Auburn and institutions modeled on it, the primary enforcement tool for most of the century was flogging, the lash applied to a prisoner's back, administered by a keeper or by the warden himself, for violations ranging from speaking out of turn to more serious infractions. The number of strokes varied by the severity of the offense and the disposition of the administrator delivering them, which meant it varied enormously, bounded at the lower end by the minimum required to constitute a deterrent and at the upper end by whatever the warden's conscience or the visiting inspector's presence happened to impose on any given occasion. Elam Linz, whom you have already encountered in the administrative history of this place, was a committed advocate of the lash and administered it personally on occasion, which he considered evidence of his investment in the institution's proper functioning rather than evidence of anything that required examination. He argued publicly that the lash was more humane than solitary confinement because it was immediate, finite, and did not damage the mind the way prolonged isolation demonstrably did. This argument was not without a certain cold logic, and historians still argue whether Linz was genuinely motivated by comparative humanitarianism or whether he simply preferred a disciplinary tool that was immediate, visible, and allowed him to remain personally in control of its application. The lash was not the only instrument available, and in some facilities and periods it was supplemented or replaced by alternatives that their inventors considered improvements. The shower bath, cold water delivered in large volume from height, sometimes for sustained periods, was used in some institutions as a punishment that left no marks on the body and could therefore be described in official reports without the complications that physical evidence of flogging occasionally created for facilities under public scrutiny. The experience of being subjected to it in a cold stone room in a northeastern winter was, by survivor accounts, sufficiently unpleasant to function as a deterrent, though its long-term effectiveness as a behavioral modification tool was, like most disciplinary interventions of the era, inconsistently documented and optimistically reported. The yoke was a wooden device, something like a broad bar worn across the shoulders and behind the neck, that forced the wearer into an upright posture and made any form of covert communication or unauthorized movement significantly more difficult and uncomfortable. It was used as a public disciplinary measure, worn during work hours so that the punished prisoner's status was visible to everyone in the workshop, which added a dimension of social humiliation to the physical discomfort. Some administrators preferred it precisely for this reason, arguing that the social visibility of punishment was itself a deterrent for others. Others argued that public punishment created sympathy for the punished among the prisoner population, which undermined institutional hierarchy rather than reinforcing it. Both were probably right in different proportions depending on the specific population and the specific keeper managing their response to the spectacle. Solitary confinement, as a disciplinary measure rather than as the Pennsylvania system's foundational philosophy, existed in Auburn-style prisons as a punishment of last resort, or at least that is how it was officially categorized. In practice, the threshold for its application varied with the same administrator-dependent inconsistency that characterized every other aspect of disciplinary life. A cell with reduced food, reduced light, and no work, which sounds like relief until you have sat in it for 48 hours and discovered that the absence of the grinding routine is not peace but a different and arguably worse form of the same grinding, the mind turning on itself in the absence of any external occupation. Prisoners sent to solitary for disciplinary purposes sometimes emerged more compliant and sometimes emerged in states that the prison medical records of the period describe with a clinical vagueness that suggests the examining physician was either genuinely uncertain what he was observing or had reasons for uncertainty that were not entirely medical. What the punishment block does to the daily experience of everyone who has not been sent to it is perhaps its most consistent effect. It is a horizon. It sits at the edge of every decision you make in this facility, every calculation about whether a particular act of resistance or communication or simple human spontaneity is worth its potential cost, and it recalibrates those decisions toward caution with an efficiency that no keeper's direct supervision could match. You police yourself more thoroughly than any external authority could manage, because the external authority has helpfully constructed a vivid and proximate image of what insufficient self-policing produces. You know men who have been inside it. One of them works 3 stations to your left in the workshop and has worked there for 4 months since his release from a week in solitary following an altercation with a keeper whose account of the incident was the only account that mattered in any official proceeding. He works now with a quality of attention that is different from the attention of the men around him, more total, more sealed, as though he has decided to be less present in his own body as a precautionary measure. You have not spoken to him, cannot speak to him, but you have watched him the way you watch everything here, carefully and from the corner of your vision, and what you see is a man who has made peace with smallness in a way that looks, from the outside, almost like calm. The punishment block sits at the far end of the yard. You do not look at it directly, but you know exactly where it is. The end-of-day bell carries a different quality than the bells that have punctuated the hours before it. You recognize it immediately, not because it is pitched differently or struck with any particular variation in force, but because your body has learned to distinguish it the way a dog learns the specific sound of its owner's car turning into the street from among all the other cars that pass. It lands in your chest and something in you unclenches by approximately 3%, which is not much but is everything available, and you set down your tool for the last time today with a deliberateness that is the closest thing to ceremony your day has offered. The count comes before the march back. This is non-negotiable and universal across virtually every American prison of the era, the evening count, in which every prisoner is accounted for by number before the population is moved from work areas back to cell blocks. The count is conducted by keepers moving through the workshop and yard with the methodical attention of men who understand that the difference between an accurate count and an inaccurate one is the difference between an unremarkable evening and an evening that will be remembered for the wrong reasons. Prisoners stand at their stations or in designated positions and are tallied with a brisk efficiency that reduces each man to his number, not his name, because names imply individuality and individuality complicates administration, and confirms his presence in the institutional ledger. The count was one of the moments that reformers and critics of the prison system occasionally pointed to as emblematic of what they found most troubling about the entire enterprise, not the violence, which was dramatic enough to generate its own outrage, but the quieter dehumanization of a system that processed men as units of institutional accounting. Dorothea Dix, the extraordinary 19th-century reformer who spent decades documenting conditions in American prisons and asylums and bringing them before legislative bodies that preferred not to look directly at what she was showing them, wrote about the count with a specificity that suggests she understood its symbolic weight as clearly as its practical function. Historians still argue whether Dix's advocacy produced meaningful structural change in the institutions she documented or whether it primarily produced a series of reports that made legislators feel they had addressed a problem by the act of receiving information about it. The institutions themselves changed slowly, if at all, and the count continued every evening regardless of who was writing about it. You are number, well, you have a number, and you know it, and you answer to it when it is called with the same flat automaticity with which you perform every other required behavior in this place. The number was assigned to you on intake and it is stenciled on your uniform and it appears in the ledger that the keeper carries and it is, for institutional purposes, more reliably you than your name, which exists somewhere in a file that nobody consults except under specific administrative circumstances. There is a theory, advanced by some prison reformers of the era and echoed by later scholars of institutional life, that the replacement of names with numbers was not merely a practical administrative convenience but a deliberate philosophical act, a staged erasure of the self that preceded and enabled the self's reconstruction along lines the institution considered more socially acceptable. Whether the administrators who implemented numbering systems thought about it in those terms is unlikely. Whether the effect was the same regardless of the intention is a more interesting question. The count finishes. The numbers tally. The lockstep forms for the last time today, and it is the same lockstep it was this morning, hand on shoulder, right foot, left foot, the column moving as its single articulated self through the yard and back toward the cell blocks, but it carries a different weight in the evening. The morning lockstep moved you toward the day with something that was not quite dread but was adjacent to it, a forward falling into hours you already knew would be long. The evening lockstep moves you toward the cell, which is not a destination anyone anticipates with pleasure, but which represents at least the cessation of supervised labor, the end of the day's particular demands, the approach of whatever the night offers in the way of respite. The yard, as you cross it in the fading light, is briefly beautiful in a way that costs you something to notice. This happens sometimes, the late afternoon sun catching the stone of the far wall at an angle that makes it look almost warm, or a strip of sky above the yard in a shade of blue that exists nowhere in the interior of the building and therefore arrives with the small shock of something you had half forgotten was available in the world. You do not linger on it. Lingering on beauty in this place is a complicated act because beauty observed against this backdrop carries the full weight of everything it is not, everything outside these walls, everything before, everything that will eventually come after if you survive the in-between with enough of yourself intact to experience it. The men around you in the lockstep have the quality of late afternoon exhaustion that is different from morning tiredness in its texture, less foggy, more settled, a heaviness that has had all day to establish itself in the muscles and the joints and the particular region behind the eyes that registers sustained effort. Some of them have been in this facility for years. You can tell, not by any single visible marker, but by a quality of movement that the long-timers share, a kind of practiced economy, a conservation of energy that operates at a level below conscious decision, the body having learned over months and years to spend only what is absolutely necessary and bank the rest against the compound interest of institutional duration. The cell block door opens ahead of you. The smell of the interior, that permanent exhalation of stone and lime and close-quartered humanity, reaches you before you cross the threshold, and your body accepts it with the resigned familiarity of something that has stopped registering as unpleasant because unpleasant requires a comparison point and the comparison point has grown distant. You file in. You find your cell. The door has not yet closed behind you, and for the 30 seconds before it does, you stand in the narrow rectangle of your world and feel, underneath everything else, the complicated and exhausted relief of another day that has been, whatever else it was, survived. Supper arrives with the same institutional ceremony as breakfast, which is to say it arrives without ceremony at all, a bowl set in front of you by hands that have performed this motion several hundred times and will perform it several hundred more, placed on the table with the brisk neutrality of someone delivering something that is technically food and technically sufficient and beyond that makes no particular claims. You are back in the mess hall, same long tables, same forward-facing arrangement, same silence pressing down on the room like a hand on a shoulder. The light is different, oil lamps now, or candles in the less well-appointed facilities, throwing a yellow warmth that is softer than daylight and makes the room look, in certain moments if you let your focus go slightly soft, almost habitable. Tonight's supper is bean soup. This is, by the standards available to you, a good evening. The beans have been cooked long enough to develop a softness that reads to your body as generosity, and there is a piece of bread, the same dense, dark bread from the morning, and if you are in a facility that allows it, a small portion of salt pork that has been boiled to a pallor suggesting it was once a different color but has made its peace with transformation. You eat with the focused attention that the time limit demands, but there is a quality of attention underneath the practical one, a lower and more animal layer of consciousness that is simply grateful for warmth and for something that tastes, however faintly, of something other than institutional neutrality. The caloric content of prison diets in 1800s America was a subject of genuine administrative debate throughout the period, with opinions ranging from reformers who argued that nutritional adequacy was a prerequisite for any meaningful rehabilitation, to cost-conscious administrators who maintained that prisoners required only enough food to sustain the labor the institution needed them to perform, to a smaller contingent of moral hardliners who believed that dietary austerity was itself a component of the punishment and that anything approaching comfort at the table was a philosophical error. The prisoners themselves were not typically consulted on this question, which is perhaps unsurprising and certainly consistent with the broader epistemological commitments of the institutions in question. What happened at supper, in the invisible register beneath the official one, was the most active phase of the prison economy. The mess hall was the most densely populated space in the daily routine, the moment of maximum proximity between the largest number of prisoners, and despite the silence rule and the keeper presence and the forward-facing seating arrangements, it was consequently the moment of maximum transactional opportunity. The economy that operated here was not elaborate in its instruments. There were no contracts, no written records, no enforcement mechanisms beyond reputation and the social weight of being known as someone who did not honor his debts, but it was sophisticated in its social architecture and remarkably stable given the constraints under which it operated. Bread was the foundational unit of exchange, being divisible, portable in the sense that it could be palmed and passed, and universally valued in a population where caloric adequacy was a persistent concern. Tobacco, where available, traded above bread in the informal hierarchy of value. Information traded above tobacco, reliable information about keeper movements, about disciplinary proceedings, about the status of particular prisoners, about anything happening in the facility's administrative machinery that might have practical consequences for the people living inside it. And above information, in the rarest and most valuable tier of the economy, sat influence, the capacity to have something done, or not done, or done differently, through the network of relationships and obligations that constituted the prison's parallel social infrastructure. A quirky detail documented in the records of several facilities involves the role of new arrivals in this economy. Fresh prisoners, men who had been in the institution for less than a few weeks, occupied a specific and somewhat vulnerable position in the social hierarchy, not yet integrated into existing networks, not yet known quantities, carrying with them the outside world in ways that made them simultaneously valuable as sources of external information and suspect as unknowns whose reliability and discretion had not been established. Experienced prisoners developed elaborate informal protocols for the evaluation and gradual incorporation of new arrivals, a process that one former prisoner, writing his memoir in the 1870s, described with an anthropological precision that suggests he had considerable time to observe and reflect on it. You have been here long enough to be past the new arrival stage, not long enough to be fully embedded in the deeper layers of the network. You occupy a middle position, known, somewhat trusted, possessed of a few reliable relationships and a few ongoing obligations that you are careful to honor because your reputation in this economy is not a luxury item but a functional necessity. The man 2 seats to your left at the supper table is one of your more reliable contacts, a prisoner who has been in the facility long enough to have a comprehensive mental map of its social geography and who shares relevant portions of that map in exchange for considerations that rotate based on what is currently available and needed. Tonight he slides his bread piece approximately 1 inch to the left before the keeper's gaze sweeps the room, and you observe this without appearing to observe it, and you understand that it represents payment for something you did 3 days ago that you were not certain had been noted. It has been noted. In the economy of this place, things are almost always noted. The bread sits where it was left. You do not move it immediately, that would be obvious, but by the time the meal ends and the bowls are collected and the line forms again, it has traveled by routes that would be difficult to reconstruct and is no longer where it began. You stand. You file out. Your stomach is fuller than it was this morning, which is a fact of some significance in a day that has offered very little else in the way of measurable improvement. You carry it with you back toward the cell block as evening deepens around the prison walls and the lamps begin their nightly argument with the dark, and the economy of scraps closes its books for another day, balanced in ways that no official ledger will ever record. The cell door closes behind you both, you and whoever the institution has decided shares this particular rectangle of stone with you, and the sound it makes is not dramatic. It is a solid, mechanical sound, the sound of a thing built to function rather than to resonate, and yet it resonates anyway, in the specific frequency of finality that you have by now internalized so completely that your body responds to it before your conscious mind has finished processing the noise. Your shoulders drop approximately half an inch. Your jaw unclenches by a similar increment. These are not choices. They are the body's own accounting, performed automatically at the moment when the day's sustained performance of compliance can be temporarily suspended because the audience, for the next several hours, is reduced to 1. Your cellmate is sitting on his plank already, which is the position most men default to upon return because it is the only sitting option available and because standing in a cell this size after a full day of standing in a workshop carries a different quality of fatigue than simply continuing to stand. He is looking at the wall opposite him with the particular unfocused attention of someone whose eyes have found a neutral resting point that asks nothing of them. You know this look. You wear it yourself. It is not vacancy, the mind behind it is almost certainly active, processing the day, cataloging its small events with the thoroughness that enforced silence tends to produce in people who have nowhere to direct their considerable capacity for observation except inward and toward each other. The intimacy of sharing a cell in an 1800s American prison was of a quality that has no precise civilian equivalent. It was not the intimacy of chosen cohabitation, not the intimacy of friendship or family or any relationship entered voluntarily. It was the intimacy of shared constraint, two people occupying the same small space under the same conditions with no mechanism for distance and no exit except the door that only opens from the outside. You knew things about your cellmate that people in the outside world knew only about those closest to them: how he slept, how he breathed in the dark, what sounds he made when a dream turned bad, how long it took him in the morning to achieve sufficient wakefulness to be addressed, whether his silences were comfortable or loaded, and what distinguished one from the other. The assignment of cellmates in most Auburn-era prisons was administrative rather than relational. Men were paired based on cell availability, on perceived compatibility in whatever limited sense the intake process could assess, occasionally on the keeper's judgment about which combinations were less likely to produce problems. The result was that men from radically different backgrounds, different regions, different social strata, different crimes, and different temperamental profiles found themselves sharing 3.5 by 7 feet with a stranger for months or years at a time. The outcomes of these pairings ran the full spectrum of human possibility. Some produced genuine friendship, relationships that prisoners maintained through correspondence for decades after release. Some produced sustained low-grade hostility that never escalated to violence but maintained a persistent Cold War quality that made the cell a different kind of punishing. Some produced the most difficult outcome, which was not hostility but indifference: two people in maximum proximity who remained essentially invisible to each other, which in a space this size required a sustained act of mutual imaginative erasure that was exhausting in its own particular way. You and your cellmate have arrived, over the weeks and months of your shared occupancy, at something in the middle range of these possibilities. Not friendship in the full sense, the conditions are not right for that, the silence rule having removed the primary medium through which friendship usually develops, but a functional understanding, a set of unwritten protocols governing the shared space that you have negotiated entirely through gesture and positioning and the careful observation of each other's responses to various arrangements. You have established, without ever discussing it, who sleeps on which plank, who uses the bucket first in the morning, whose turn it is to manage whatever small domestic tasks the cell requires. These negotiations were conducted over days and weeks through a process of trial and adjustment that resembles nothing so much as two animals establishing territory, except that the territory is 6 feet long and the animals are human and therefore considerably more complicated about it. The unwritten rules of cell sharing in this era, reconstructed from memoirs and later oral histories, included some that were universal enough to constitute genuine prison-wide norms. You did not touch another man's allocated possessions without permission, even when permission could not be verbally requested. You developed other ways of asking. You did not perform your bodily functions with any more audience than the cell size made strictly unavoidable. You did not make sounds at night that were under your control, deliberate sounds, communicative sounds, without being reasonably certain that your cellmate was either asleep or willing. You did not, above all, inform on your cellmate to keepers for minor infractions, because the social cost of being known as an informer was the highest cost the prison economy levied, and it was levied without appeals process or mitigation. Your cellmate shifts on his plank and produces a sound that is not quite a sigh and not quite a word but is somewhere in the register between them, a human sound, the kind that escapes before the silence rule's internalized enforcement catches it, and you receive it with the understanding that it requires no response and simultaneously that it is a form of communication, a small acoustic acknowledgement of shared existence in this space on this evening after this particular day. You produce a corresponding sound, equally minimal, equally deniable as language if a keeper were somehow listening. It is the closest thing to conversation available to you. Outside the cell, the block settles into its evening sounds. The institutional machinery winds down by degrees. And in this cell, in this narrow space with its 2 planks and its bucket and its lime-washed walls, the complicated ecosystem of proximity continues its quiet, unrecorded life, 2 people learning, with the patience that only necessity can teach, the difficult art of being human in conditions specifically designed to make that art as difficult as possible. The lamps go out, or are taken out, or turned down to nothing, depending on the facility's specific protocol, and the dark that follows is not the dark of a bedroom with curtains drawn or a country road without streetlights. It is institutional dark, the dark of a space built from stone several feet thick with windows sized to admit minimal light in the daytime and therefore admitting essentially none at night. It settles into the cell block with a completeness that your eyes, even after extended adjustment, cannot fully negotiate. You can see the vague geometry of your cellmate's form on his plank. You can see, if you look toward the small window, a shade of dark that is marginally less absolute than the dark of the walls, suggesting that sky exists somewhere beyond the stone, that the world continues to have a sky. That is approximately the full extent of what vision offers you until morning. What hearing offers is considerably more. The cell block at night is an acoustic document of the population inside it, more honest than any official record, more revealing than any administrative report. It begins, in the first hour after lights out, with the sounds of bodies settling, the creak of wooden planks accepting weight, the shift and compression of straw mattresses, the particular sound of a man arranging himself for sleep in a space that does not accommodate comfortable arrangement and therefore requires a kind of nightly negotiation between the body and the plank that the body reliably loses. These are neutral sounds, mechanical sounds, the sounds of physical logistics. Then the other sounds begin. Coughing is the constant. It moves through the cell block in the dark with the organic persistence of something that belongs to the environment rather than to any individual, a cough from the far end of the block, then a response from somewhere closer, then a brief cluster of 3 or 4, then silence, then one more solitary cough from a direction you cannot precisely locate, because sound in a stone corridor with closed doors bounces and reflects in ways that defeat triangulation. The coughing is partly the coughing of men with genuine respiratory ailments, which were endemic in prison populations of this era. Tuberculosis moved through 19th-century prisons with a consistency that administrators documented, worried about, occasionally attempted to address, and largely failed to control. Partly it is the coughing of men who are cold, or damp, or whose lungs have been compromised by workshop dust or forge smoke over months of labor in inadequately ventilated spaces. And partly, this is the part that takes you a while to understand and longer to fully absorb, the coughing is communication. A cough can mean many things in a space where speech is prohibited. A single deliberate cough at a particular moment can mean I am awake, or I heard that, or yes, or be careful. A cough can mask the sound of words spoken at the threshold of audibility. Two coughs in quick succession carry a different meaning than two coughs separated by a pause, and the men who have been here longest have developed a fluency in this acoustic code that newer arrivals spend weeks attempting to decode. It is, in its way, a remarkable achievement, an entire parallel language built from a bodily function so involuntary that it cannot be prohibited without prohibiting biology itself. Prayers are another sound of the night block, and they carry their own complicated freight. The official position of most American prison administrations throughout the 1800s was strongly pro-religious. Prison chaplains were employed at most major facilities, Sunday services were mandatory in many, and the rhetoric of moral reformation that justified the entire penal project was saturated with Protestant Christian assumptions about sin, repentance, and the possibility of the soul's reconstruction. In practice, the relationship between prisoners and institutional religion was as varied as the prisoners themselves. Some men prayed with what sounded like genuine conviction, their voices barely audible through the cell door, a murmur that carried no specific words but had the rhythm and cadence of something learned young and not forgotten. Others performed prayer with the same quality they brought to every other required behavior, compliance without investment, the body going through motions the spirit had quietly exited. Others prayed in languages the institution did not recognize, in traditions the chaplain could not accommodate, which was its own form of private persistence. The weeping is the sound you hear least often and remember most completely. It does not happen every night, most nights pass without it, but when it comes it is unmistakable, and it produces in the block a specific quality of collective stillness, as though the men who are not weeping have collectively decided to make more room for the sound by becoming quieter themselves. It is almost never loud. Men in this environment have learned, even in extremity, to contain their grief within dimensions that will not draw keeper attention, which means the weeping you hear through the walls and doors is a compressed, careful, muffled thing, sorrow performing its own form of institutional compliance. It is somehow worse for that. The effort it takes to weep quietly in a stone cell in the dark is its own evidence of something that no reformer's report and no warden's annual summary adequately captured about what this place cost the people inside it. Historians still argue about the psychological effects of nocturnal isolation on 19th-century prisoners, whether the nights were primarily restorative, giving the mind and body recovery time from the day's demands, or primarily additional punishment, the enforced darkness and silence providing conditions in which anxiety and grief and the accumulated weight of institutional life could not be distracted away but had to be faced in whatever way each man was capable of facing them. The surviving accounts suggest both were true for different men at different times and for the same man at different points in his sentence, which is perhaps the most honest answer available. You lie on your plank in the dark and you listen, and the block's night sounds move around you like a landscape you have learned to navigate without light. Somewhere to your left, 3 or 4 cells down, the tapping begins, soft, irregular, the wall code that you know partially and are still learning. You listen to it with one layer of your attention while another layer begins the slow dissolution into sleep that the body insists on regardless of what the mind is doing. The tapping continues. A cough. A creak. A breath. The dark, pressing in from all sides with its complete and indifferent weight. And somewhere in the block, someone is counting. You can almost hear it, not the sound of counting, which produces no sound, but the quality of it, the sense of a mind moving through numbers in the dark as a way of moving through time, which is the oldest and most available technology for surviving a night that will not end until it decides to. While you lie in the dark counting ceiling stones you cannot see, a war is being fought over you. Not over you specifically, you are not important enough to the people conducting this war for your specific case to occupy their deliberations, but over the idea of you, over what you represent, over what ought to be done with a person who has ended up where you have ended up and what the doing of it is supposed to accomplish. This war is conducted in lecture halls and legislative chambers and the pages of reform journals and the correspondence of men and women who have visited facilities like this one and left with strong opinions about what they observed, and it has been running at various levels of intensity since before you arrived here and will continue running long after you leave. It is, in its way, one of the more consequential intellectual conflicts of 19th-century American life, and you are living inside one of its primary exhibits without being invited to offer testimony. The central dispute is between two models of imprisonment that represent genuinely different philosophies about human nature, social order, and the possibility of moral change. The Auburn system, your system, the one whose silence and lockstep and contract labor you have been navigating since the bell woke you before dawn, believed that criminals could be reformed through the discipline of congregate labor and enforced silence, that the habits of industry and obedience, practiced daily under strict supervision, would eventually become genuine internalized values rather than performed compliance. The Pennsylvania system, centered on Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, believed that reformation required solitude, that the criminal soul needed to be stripped of all external social influence, good and bad alike, and left alone with its conscience and a Bible until genuine repentance became the only available interior weather. These were not minor procedural disagreements. They represented fundamentally different theories of what a human being was and what could be done to change one. The Auburn position implied that behavior was the primary reality, that if you could shape what a man did, day after day, you would eventually shape what he was. The Pennsylvania position implied that interiority was primary, that external behavior was merely the symptom of an inner condition, and that the inner condition was what required treatment. Reformers who visited both systems and tried to evaluate them dispassionately found themselves confronting the uncomfortable possibility that both were producing roughly similar outcomes by different routes, which raised the further uncomfortable possibility that neither was producing outcomes as good as their advocates claimed. The European dimension of this debate adds a layer of complexity that American administrators found alternately flattering and irritating. In the 1830s and 1840s, the question of which American prison model was superior became something of an obsession among European penal reformers seeking models for their own systems, and the resulting transatlantic conversation produced a remarkable volume of literature. Alexis de Tocqueville and Gustave de Beaumont visited American prisons in 1831 specifically to study the two systems and wrote a report that became influential in French penal reform discussions, though their more famous work from the same journey, Democracy in America, has somewhat overshadowed their prison research in the subsequent centuries of reading and citation. The two young Frenchmen came away impressed by American administrative ambition and genuinely uncertain about American administrative effectiveness, a verdict that would have satisfied neither side of the Auburn, Pennsylvania debate. Dorothea Dix, whose name has already appeared in the administrative ledger of this day, represents perhaps the most important voice in the reform conversation that operated at a different register than the Auburn, Pennsylvania debate, not concerned primarily with which congregate method was superior but with the basic conditions of prisoner welfare, with whether the people inside these institutions were being treated in ways consistent with their humanity regardless of the philosophical framework being applied to them. Dix's method was documentary and relentless. She visited institutions across multiple states, recorded what she found with a specificity that made her reports difficult to dismiss as sentimental, and presented her findings to legislative bodies with a persistence that was, by the accounts of people who observed her in action, genuinely formidable. Historians still argue about the degree to which Dix's advocacy produced structural change versus symbolic acknowledgement, whether the legislative responses her reports generated represented genuine reform or the political equivalent of filing a complaint in a drawer. But her documentary work remains among the most important primary sources for understanding what American institutions of confinement actually looked like in the mid-19th century, as opposed to what their administrators said they looked like. The labor question intersects with the reform debate in ways that neither side found entirely comfortable. If the purpose of prison was reformation, then labor was a means to that end, discipline and habit formation. But if prison labor was profitable enough to attract private contractors and generate institutional revenue, then the economic incentives created by that profitability had a tendency to reshape the labor in ways that served the contract rather than the convict. Prisoners worked faster, longer, and at tasks chosen for their productivity rather than their rehabilitative value. Quotas were set by contractors negotiating with administrators, not by reformers consulting theories of moral development. The gap between the rhetorical purpose of prison labor and its actual daily operation was wide enough that critics pointed to it regularly and loudly, and administrators closed it rhetorically while leaving it structurally intact. What none of this debate, the philosophical, the legislative, the transatlantic, quite managed to center was the experience of the person inside the institution. Your experience. The question of what any of these systems felt like from the inside, what they produced in terms of actual human outcomes for the men subjected to them, was addressed in the reform literature primarily through the lens of recidivism statistics that were inconsistently collected and opportunistically interpreted, rather than through any sustained attempt to understand the subjective reality of incarceration. The men who wrote memoirs of their prison experiences, and some did, a small and valuable documentary tradition, wrote largely for audiences who needed to be persuaded that the experience was worth writing about, which shaped the memoirs in ways that complicate their use as straightforward testimony. You are the data that the debate is about and the voice that the debate does not include, which is perhaps the most complete summary of your position available. The war continues outside these walls. You continue inside them. The two facts coexist in the same historical moment without meaningfully touching each other, which is its own kind of commentary on the distance between the people who design systems and the people who live in them. The bell will ring again in a few hours. You know this with the certainty of someone for whom the bell has become the primary unit of temporal measurement, the fixed point around which all other experience organizes itself. Before it was the bell, it was the clock, or the sun, or the rhythm of meals and sleep and work chosen according to your own needs and preferences and the particular shape of whatever life you were living. Now it is the bell, and the bell does not negotiate, and the bell does not consider whether you are ready, and the bell has been ringing for however many mornings you have been here and will ring for however many mornings remain before the institution releases you back into a world that will have continued moving while you were standing still inside these walls. The question of how men survived long sentences in 19th-century American prisons, not physically, though physical survival was its own significant project, but psychologically, in terms of maintaining enough of a coherent self to walk out at the end of a sentence and recognize the person doing the walking, is one that the reform literature of the era addressed almost entirely in the abstract and that the prisoners themselves addressed in practice with whatever tools were available to them. The tools were not impressive by any external measure. They were the tools of interiority and habit and the stubborn persistence of identity under conditions specifically designed to erode it. Memory was the primary tool. Not nostalgia exactly. Nostalgia implies a sweetness, a warm looking back, and what most prisoners describe in their accounts is something more functional and less comfortable than that. Memory as a practice, a deliberate daily exercise in which the details of a life before were rehearsed with the regularity of a musician practicing scales, not for the pleasure of the exercise but to prevent the loss of fluency. Men who had been inside for several years described the effort of remembering the faces of their children, their wives, their parents, with a specificity that suggests the effort was real and the anxiety of potential forgetting was genuine. The face of someone you love is not permanently installed in memory the way a fact is installed. It requires maintenance, active recall, the deliberate return to its details, and in a place with no photographs and no visits except occasional and highly regulated ones, that maintenance was entirely the work of the interior. Some men maintained themselves through the cultivation of expertise that the institution could not access or regulate. A prisoner who had been a lawyer before his conviction spent his years inside conducting a sustained internal review of every case he had ever worked, refining arguments, reconsidering decisions, building a mental archive of legal analysis that occupied the thinking portions of his mind during the hours his hands were occupied with shoemaking or barrel staving. A farmer reconstructed in meticulous mental detail the layout of his land, the rotation of his crops, the specific qualities of different fields in different seasons, maintaining a kind of interior agricultural practice that kept his knowledge alive and his connection to a future in which he might return to that land from decaying entirely. These were not escapes from the prison so much as annexes built alongside it, additional rooms in the interior architecture of the self where the institution's authority did not reach. The men who fared worst, by the accounts that survive, were those who had no such annex available, men whose pre-prison lives had not furnished them with the kind of interior resources that sustained this kind of practice, men who were very young and had little accumulated life to rehearse, men whose social networks outside had collapsed during their incarceration through death or abandonment or simple temporal erosion. For these men, the institution's erosive work was less impeded, and the self it was eroding had fewer reserves. The reform literature occasionally acknowledged this in its more honest moments, noting that the prison produced different outcomes in different men not because the institution was applied inconsistently but because the men were different to begin with, a recognition that complicated the universalist assumptions underlying both the Auburn and Pennsylvania systems and was therefore not dwelt upon at length by advocates of either. The concept of release, of the sentence ending, the door opening, the return to the world outside, was its own psychological complexity for long-term prisoners. Men who had been inside for 5, 7, 10 years emerged into a world that had reorganized itself in their absence, that had developed new technologies and new social arrangements and new assumed knowledges that the released prisoner did not share. The railroad network had expanded. Cities had grown. Prices had changed. The people who had known them had aged, moved, died, forgotten. Several documented accounts from released prisoners in the latter half of the 19th century describe the experience of release as disorienting in ways that were almost as difficult to manage as the incarceration itself. The sudden presence of choice, of noise, of unregulated social interaction, arriving after years of the opposite, produced a kind of overwhelm that the prison had done nothing to prepare them for and that the outside world had no infrastructure to help them navigate. Historians still argue about what the American prison system of the 1800s actually accomplished, whether it reduced crime, whether it reformed individuals, whether it served justice in any meaningful sense, or whether it was primarily a mechanism for managing populations that industrial society was producing faster than it could absorb, dressed in the language of moral improvement to make the management feel like something more elevated than containment. The argument has not been resolved because the evidence supports multiple conclusions depending on what you are willing to count as evidence and what you have decided the system was for. You lie on your plank in the dark, and the block breathes around you. The coughs, the creaks, the distant tapping, the occasional compressed sound of someone's interior life briefly breaching its own surface. Your body is tired in the deep, settled way of something that has been used thoroughly and will be used thoroughly again in a few hours. Your mind moves through its familiar rooms, the before, the now, the carefully maintained hope of the after, with the practiced efficiency of someone who has learned to make a large interior life in a very small exterior space. The bell will ring. You will rise. The door will open and the corridor will receive you and the lockstep will form and the mess hall will offer its cornmeal and the workshop will claim your hands and the keeper's keys will jangle their familiar rhythm through another day that is identical to this one in every institutional particular and different from it only in the ways that days are always different from each other when you are paying close enough attention, which you are, which you have become, which this place has made of you whether it intended that specific outcome or not. You close your eyes. The dark behind them is the same dark as the dark in front of them, which is either the most oppressive feature of your current situation or a kind of democracy that the institution has accidentally provided, the same darkness available to everyone, keeper and prisoner alike, the great leveling of the extinguished lamp. You choose, because you can choose this, to find it almost funny. Almost. The almost is important. The almost is, in its small way, the self refusing to be entirely consumed by the machine it is living inside. Sleep comes the way it always comes here, not as relief exactly, but as the body's final, reasonable insistence on its own needs regardless of what the day has cost or what the morning will require. You go toward it the way you go toward everything in this place, one step at a time, without ceremony, because ceremony is for people with more room than you currently have. The bell will ring. Not yet. But soon.